Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, my name is David Myers, host of today's Then and Now, and director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. In today's charged political environment in the United States, we are witnessing the reversal of a slow-moving pendulum of change that from the 1950s was moving toward a greater spirit of diversity, equity, and inclusion in American institutions of higher learning. The aim of expanding the portal to these institutions to people, particularly people of color, who had been excluded or limited, was central to the project of affirmative action and of DEI. In recent years, though, the pendulum has been pushed in an opposite direction. In June 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States reversed decades of precedent by ending race-conscious admissions programs at colleges and universities across the country. And more recently, the new administration of President Donald Trump has taken aim at DEI, both as a term and institutional strategy. Today's podcast provides important historical perspective to these strategies of inclusion, looking at the history of affirmative action and, in the case of UCLA, the high potential program intended to advance the prospects for success of Black and Latinx students. Our guest is Dr. Jamaal Muwwakkil, who is a University of California Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow at UCLA in the Department of Education and Information Systems, and an incoming Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Washington. Dr. Muwwakkil offers a distinctive perspective as a sociolinguist, especially in discussing the jagged historical course of Black students at universities in the era of affirmative action. He is ever attentive to the use of language as a barometer of social change and difference, and there's much to learn from his approach. Welcome to Then and Now, Jamaal.
Great to be here with you, David.
So tell us about your own personal path to the study of sociolinguistics. Where does that start and how did it proceed?
Yeah, so I was always been more or less a curious child and really attentive to language. And specifically what I came to know was the social implications and the social meaning that we make as people, because language is like a social interactive activity, right? And I didn't know what that was called until you started to think about majors and undergrad and what have you. And as a first generation college student, I really didn't know what majors even were, but I knew that there was an intended response, an expected response that you would have when people asked you. My first answer was psychology, like so many of our undergraduates right now. And I realized that after psychology, people had follow-up questions like, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to grad school? Are you trying to be a practitioner? And I didn't have the answers to these questions in my youth. So I decided to think of another word to respond. And that word was linguistics. Before I even knew what linguistics was, I just started saying to people, I'm studying linguistics. Yes. No one knew what that was. So they give me the credibility of, that sounds fancy because I don't know what it is. And I didn't have to answer any more follow-up questions. Mission accomplished. But as a community college student, I happen to have the great privilege of being able to take a linguistics class. And I found out that I really do love this, the systematic and scientific study of language in its smallest parts to its more macro scale. And studied at UCLA in linguistics and realized that there's a dominant thread of the study of linguistics that is less interactional and less to do with the questions that I found interesting, specifically questions of like social identity and implication, linguistic play, things like this. And I found that work was being done at UC Santa Barbara, which is where and places like that, which is where I did my graduate work. And so I've been really interested in that dimension of language, starting from a UCLA trajectory, learning what I can in this context, building on that in grad school, trying different types of stuff. And lots of projects came to through that path. I did an ethnographic study of the discourses of conservative student groups as a master's project. I did the dissertation on on Black undergraduates in the historically white institutional context, and really doing a lot of work that sometimes is really surprising to other linguists that this is possible.
Why so? What is surprising?
Well, most people, for good or for bad, they hear linguistics and they hear that it's kind of dry. Maybe even in your experience or others, if you've taken a linguistics course, sometimes people consider it very difficult and very dry, very decontextualized, dehumanized, right? An example is, like say, the study of phonetics really focuses on individual sounds and how we put these sounds together to make meaning, right? And then phonology is how we organize those sounds into what we might consider words. And how we get meaning in that regard. And so a lot of it can come off as like word games and word puzzles. That is a pretty far cry from, like, say, variation, like African American English or Chicano Spanish or things like this, right? And so if that's been your only exposure to what linguistics is, and most people have, they just feel like it's not a thing for them or not a thing that folks can do to really deeply engage in social implications. But that is not true, in fact, right? And myself and a lot of my colleagues do a lot of great work in these types of areas, even if it is kind of pushing back against disciplinary orthodoxy.
So tell me a little bit more about your own genealogy. What was it about language per se, language and lived experience that really, sorry for the pun intended, spoke to you?
Absolutely. Well, so I'm a native speaker of African American English, which is a variety of English that that a lot of folks in the U.S. Speak. I came to find over my own personal interactions that that variety is oftentimes stigmatized in a lot of contexts like the classroom, right? Contexts like the professional world broadly, right? That there are ideas that come to mind when a person speaks in such a way. You kind of make associations, there's indexes, right? The idea of like, oh, you sound like this, you must be from there. This is not inherently a bad thing. It's pattern recognition. We as humans do this all the time. Find out what correlates with what behavior and tell ourselves a story about who these new people are that we're meeting. But sometimes there's a negative consequence that's associated with that manifests in something like prejudice. As a person from a place like I'm from, which is Compton, California, sounding like the people who are from Compton, California, I graduate from high school and I start working at other places. I worked at, had so many jobs during community college. I worked at Foot Locker at the Lakewood Mall. I worked at Disneyland for a time. I worked for what used to be Singular Wireless in a call center. And I, of course, attentive to the way that people show up to work, the way that people make up ideas and thoughts around behavior, competence, intelligence associated with how you sound or how you're taken to sound. And this has all been very fascinating to me. I've always been curious about like what are people attending to, and more, true for the impact on the back end is what they're attending to, or the conclusion that they're drawing. Is that true? Is it true that just because you sound a way, that you are a way? And of course, my work in a huge body of research within linguistics refutes that idea. It says, no, you sound like where you're from, but that has nothing to do with your idea of trustworthiness or intelligence. It's just communication. We do it as humans.
So I'm interested in really jumping into your research, but I just have to say I'm intrigued by the prospect of a sociolinguistic analysis of Disneyland, where you spent time working. Like, did you pay attention to language then when you were working at Disneyland?
Oh, and indeed I did. Disney is a special place. The people who like Disney love Disney. There's no middle ground on Disney, right? You either love it or you hate it.
I'm on the other side, I'm afraid to say.
On the hate side of Disney?
Hate I wouldn't say, but love I would not say either.
Okay, so you're the rare middle ground
No,
here.
no. It tends more to the not
the dislike. Okay, a hearty dislike. I'm right there with you. You and me both, David. The idea here is that, yes, there is an interesting kind of performance that is you're trained to do in the Disney context as cast members, is what they call you, because you're putting on a show. Employees are cast members. And you're on stage when you're in like visual proximity of the guests who are coming. And you're supposed to really perform an idea of Americana that's really interestingly curated. An example of this is men can't have beards, but they may have mustaches. So you can have a mustache, but no goatee, no beard. Like to the point of like you have to shave. If you will be asked to shave if you come up to work with like too distinctive a 5 o'clock shadow, right? There's a pointing. I don't know if you've seen the Disney point with 2 fingers, the index and the middle finger, as opposed to a singular point. It's still with me. It's still in my body. But yes, lots of other like very intentional, specific curation of presentations of identities within the Disney context.
Okay, let's talk about you and your work. Your research has focused, among other things, on Black students in U.S. universities, especially in historically white institutions. And I want to hear from you what first drew you to that.
Yeah, well, it's always been the plan to really center my research agenda on Black populations. I know that that's sometimes a controversial stance that some folks will feel as Black individuals or Black scholars that they can feel pigeonholed. You're expecting me to do work on Black folks. And maybe they'll resist that because they're saying I'm a full scholar independently. I don't have to. I take a different posture. While I respect that one, it's not so much that I feel like I have to, but I'm excited to get to. I'm excited for the opportunity to be able to explore in detail the phenomena of Black folks in social life, right? And so in this context, I came with, truthfully, some preconceived notions, right? Both in my undergrad and grad experience, I assumed that Black folks in the space were like me, from places like where I was from. They had experiences like that I had, and we had a lot of connection and shared kind of history in that context. And that was true for some of them, right? For some of my peers and colleagues on the undergrad or the grad side, that absolutely was true. But what I was really, really struck by was that for so many, I might even argue the majority of folks that I encountered, a lot of them not only had varied or different experiences than I did, but had a very different understanding, experience, and relationship to Black community. And that struck me. And I wanted to figure this out. So just to kind of cast my general idea of preparing to do a study, right? Writing a prospectus and kind of getting this idea done, I thought that maybe the issue was that everyone was coming from different Black communities, and that in order to make a cohesive kind of university undergraduate identity, it was cobbled together from a lot of different Black communities from around the nation and the world, right? So maybe you had some folks from Brooklyn that brung a thing, some people from North Carolina that brung a thing, some people from Oakland that brung a thing, and then you show up in a maybe SoCal university, and it's an interesting kind of hodgepodge that is distinct unto itself, but comprised of a lot of different influences from multiple Black communities across the world. And in the investigation thereof, ethnographically, I found that wasn't as true as I thought it was. I found something a bit more striking, right? The thing that I found was that an overwhelming majority, a large proportion, more than 50% of the people that I engaged with, they were from communities where they had been one of very few Black people in their residential area and their schooling area, right? So K-12 and whatnot. And that the historically white university was the Blackest place that they had ever spent very much time. And so what that meant was that there was an interesting implication, right? That it implicated admissions for the, say in this case, the University of California, and where we're kind of drawing from as far as our undergraduate population, specifically our Black populations. But it also demonstrates that the university is serving another very interesting function, which is the socialization of folks into different community dynamics and community groups. In this case, I didn't think it was initially, but it turns out that this is true, that a lot of Black undergraduates are learning how to do Blackness in community for the first time in the historically white institutional context. So
Can I pause you at that moment? Because I'm really intrigued by your own personal realization, which is, it sounds like when you encountered this phenomenon, and I've heard you tell the story before, you encountered it early on in your college career.
Yes.
It disabused you of your own sense of a kind of essentialist, monolithic Black community. Is that a fair summary of what you came to realize?
Yes, in a lot of different senses, right? So in one sense, it broadened the scope of what I understood is possible amongst like Black experiences over time. A good example of this is the idea of meaningfully interacting with a lot of folks from the diaspora, right? From the Caribbean, from the continent, right? From Nigeria, from Kenya, from Ethiopia, right? Hadn't had too much meaningful engagement with folks from these places in my pre-college life because I didn't see a lot of them in Compton, in places like Compton. So in one sense, it's like, this is really cool, right? Black folks can be from everywhere and have different histories and be closer in some ways to other things, cultural praxis. So it's a point of exploration and curiosity for me to say, to learn from these folks and have them learn from me. But I always assumed, just as a person, from my personal experience, I always assumed that Black folks, hopefully not sounding too flat here, but I always assumed that Black folks knew other Black folks, right? It seems like a safe assumption, right? That, at least if you're a Black person, you have Black parents, at least one, maybe Black siblings, Black cousins, aunts, uncles, Black neighbors, friends like this, all of this I took for granted, right? Because it was my experience. But it's not necessarily true, right, for a lot of folks. And so the things that I think of as necessarily like intrinsically Black, or a Black affect, a Black disposition, a Black political consciousness, I had to really embrace and study and explore the ideas that these are socialized dispositions, that they come as a function of being interactionally engaged with other folks in a similar context, and that they are acquired, and that they're not acquired in the absence of those interactive moments.
Mm-hmm. So you have developed earlier in your career this more complex matrix of Blackness, and how it is formed, and what particular forms it takes in different individuals. I want to bring into the picture something that's been of recurrent interest to you, which is affirmative action,
Yes.
and sort of ask you, how did that enter into the story? Because it's very understandable how you would bring your sociolinguistic lens to the study of different kinds of Black cultural backgrounds and dispositions, and maybe different linguistic communities, bilingual, not monolingual. Where did affirmative action fit in? I mean, it's kind of seems intuitive, but maybe you can make it explicit for us.
Yeah, and I appreciate that question because it's the part of the idea that is the policy alignment, right? And I love the framing of this show, right? Then and now, right? So that we are in the now, living in the outcomes and the implications associated with what happened then, right? And so looking at affirmative action is a great place to start to try to get at, how did we get here? Like, why is the world shaped in the way that it is, right? So as it relates to affirmative action, of course, this is a tricky term. It's becoming kind of differently oriented to in the contemporary moment for reasons. But historically, the idea was, just to do some foundation setting for American history, you have the context of not just the enslavement of Africans and towards the founding of the United States of America, but treatment of those same formerly enslaved Africans post-emancipation, development of things like the Black codes and what came to be understood as the Jim Crow laws, the idea of separate but equal coming out of a Plessy v. Ferguson frame. And then you get to a point of, say, Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, 55, that says...
54, I'm the historian here, yeah.
Exactly, 1954, that says, hey, we can't do segregation. Separate or equal is inherently not equal, and so we got to do integration. Awesome, right? Awesome for most. For an idea of awesome, a potential awesome eventuality, right? But then you have this other idea that happens simultaneously, which is a resistance from the majority population, the majority racial population, to say, we don't really want to do that. Let's see if we can kind of develop some machinations, some ways of kind of moving around it, right? Not long after that, you have the Civil Rights Act that establishes that we can't do discrimination in the same way that we have been, and that we have to do, this is where the idea of affirmative action, early 60s, comes in. Affirmative action isn't a policy, right? It's a disposition, right? It's the idea of saying institutions, government contractors, people who are getting government funds, be it businesses or schools or institutions, you have to abide by these rules if you would like to get access to our government funds. One of the things that we need you to do is to take affirmative action or intentional positive steps towards integration, right? And that looks like, which is of my own interest, that looks like programs, that looks like local policies, right? Different things that different institutions do in order to effectuate that end, right? So just to clarify, affirmative action is not one big policy, but it's an orientation and an encouragement that folks on the local level will do however makes sense for them.
Yeah, I just want to say that we've discussed affirmative action on the show a number of times with our friend and colleague, Professor Eddie Cole.
Awesome. That's what's up. And I'm sure he's doing way more justice to it than I am. So shout out to
You're
Eddie.
great.
Please watch that episode. So the idea here is moving forward, we get kind of a narrowing of the scope, right? So in one way that maybe some schools might have done, like say the University of California, Davis, in their medical school admissions, might say, look, we're going to have some set-asides, right? Historically underrepresented folks, Black folks included, but also other folks, we're going to set aside some spaces for those so that we can kind of do the work that needs doing. And this becomes challenged in the Bakke case, UC Regents versus Bakke in 1978, who, as a consequence, found that to be unconstitutional, that you cannot set aside an amount, right? Colloquially understood as like quotas. You can't set aside an amount for folks. You got to do it another way, right? But at the time, you could still do race consciousness in your admission.
You could take race into consideration. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so as we move forward, we see that idea of race consciousness itself is being challenged, right? So in Prop 209 in California in 1996, you see that got on the ballot and was supported. That passed. Now in California, you can't do race consciousness in admissions and hiring or contracting. This is now where we get the development of like the DEI frame, diversity, equity, inclusion, narrating the idea that universities have a compelling interest in a diverse undergraduate population, diverse student body, a diverse faculty. And so really trying to fight to advocate for their right to diversify. But there has never been a point at which the idea of remedying or addressing historical wrongs or disparities has not been challenged. And we're seeing in the contemporary moment a lot of success, or rather a lot of undoing of what we thought was historical progress over the past few months that took a few decades to get. It's an interesting time. So to answer your question more directly about how that overlaps with my research, what I'm finding is that the way we do admissions incentivizes certain types of looking and certain types of student profiles that we're interested in exploring, to meet the needs without like doing certain types of work. An example of this could be we have become, as a public research university, the University of California, relatively prestigious, right? We're high ranked, and we do chase that. We have great marketing as well. So we like the idea that we're accepting fewer and fewer of a percentage of students who apply. We love that UCLA is the most applied to school in the world. It's a point of great pride. And what that looks like is you're saying no to more and more students who apply. And the question is, what is the profile of the students who are applying? Where are you drawing them from? And what is the cost of that? One might say, if you happen to find yourself as a Black undergraduate at a place like UCLA, and that UCLA, with its 2 to 4% Black population overall, is the Blackest place you've ever been, and you find that that's true amongst all of your Black peers as well, which is not true. We're saying there's a diversity, but for the sake of argument, then that we might be able to trace that back to the admissions policies, how we look, where we look, what we find is valuable. And that aligns with and has implications for our mission as a public research university. I might argue at the end of that exploration that we might be falling short of our duty as a public research university if it is the case that we're only ever doing a very overtly prestigious, and or, if I was going to be a bit more provocative, that you prefer Black undergraduates who are non-Black community identified. Mm-hmm. That would seem to be contrary to the purpose.
Yeah.
Overall.
So I want to go back and talk a little bit more of the history, especially of programs at UCLA that kind of anticipated an affirmative action as it would take rise in the wake of the Bakke decision. But I wonder if you could offer just a kind of macro historical perspective, a kind of bird's eye view on affirmative action. Like we've sort of witnessed its rise and we seem to be also witnessing its fall or its very significant constriction. How do you assess it as a tool of reform, reparation, corrective? What's your overall assessment of its efficacy and impact?
Yeah, I do think that, as we mentioned before, that it's not any one thing, but it's an orientation more than anything. And I think that what's clear, and I think a part of what we've been missing and moving further away from, is the remediation element of it, right? The idea of, given the history, right? Given the structural disenfranchisement and oppression of a group that predictably set folks on a different path, we need to do things to remedy that. That seems to be less and less palatable as time goes on. And I can guess as to why, but I do think that it is a shame, right? I wish that weren't true. And so because it is the case that I think that it was always intended, affirmative action, to serve a remediation function, and that we have never fully done that because there's always been constant attacks and there's always been supplemental capitulation to those attacks, that we've gotten further and further away from what we were even trying to do in the first place. So in one sense, I don't consider affirmative action policies or otherwise to be reparations in its contemporary kind of sense. I do consider that we need it if we're ever going to get to a place where we can have a consistent, solid base of folks where we could find ourselves in a place where we wouldn't need it, right? But given that we can't seem to do it, right? Given that we can't seem to conceptualize of an idea of, to put it bluntly, how do we educate Black students? How do we enfranchise Black Americans? How do we resource these folks who have been historically under-resourced? Like, to even ask the question is now provocative in a way that I don't think is a given. It does not have to be provocative. It doesn't have to be necessarily a negative valence or an attack on any personal identity or institution. it can stand as a question that begs an answer. And there are multiple answers that are possible. But what I'm finding is we're not engaging in what are the possible answers. We're exploring all the ways why we can't do literally anything.
Mhm.
And I don't think that that's sustainable.
So I'm curious again in the sociolinguistic angle on this, because you could do a very interesting sociolinguistic analysis of the way in which the very valence of affirmative action, or for that matter, diversity, has changed dramatically over the course of time. And in fact is quite different in different groups of people, generally aligned along a somewhat predictable ideological spectrum, though there are exceptions to that. So I'm wondering, again, what the sociolinguist takes from the phenomenon of affirmative action and its arc from, say, Bakke to the present.
Absolutely. There's some interesting work that's happening around the idea of pejoration, right? Which is like the process through which you make a thing to be negatively stigmatized, right? So consider the idea of affirmative action, right? That's a positive word, right? Affirmative, in the right direction, positive, intentional, right? But stigmatized as necessarily being unfair or mitigated on the basis of merit, right? This word merit comes in, right? And so what merit means in a broad sense is whatever you need it to mean, but it means it has a resonance with fairness, right? The idea of fairness and affirmative action being cast in such a way that it has a resonance of unfairness. Just to put that in context, we don't have the same affiliation or association with the ideas of, say, legacy admissions as an unfair paradigmatic frame or a way to do admissions in a college context, right? But we might for affirmative action. And the question has to come, like, why is that true? If we're saying there's any advantage in the admissions process, if there's any advantage in the hiring process, all advantages should be available for equal pejoration, right? Equal stigmatization. But it seems like there's some that are and some that aren't. And then we can figure out, like, well, what are the resonances across the ones that are? And then we can do a historical analysis. We try to do affirmative action, and that framing, it's cast as necessarily unfair, to giving positions to unworthy or underworthy folks. Pivot happens to accommodate, I would argue, for a lot of those folks who are resistant to that frame into DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And then that's cast in the exact same light. So now those things are synonymous. Affirmative action policies are synonymous with, say, a quota frame that is, quote, that is necessarily within this framing unfair. And so is DEI. So all of these are now synonymous, right? Affirmative action, quotas, DEI. Same word, all bad, unfair, no merit. If I was taking this, if the discourse was such that it was all very one-to-one, like I was to take you at your word as a denotational utterance, I would imagine that you would say, oh, the position on the other side is just, you want fairness, you want merit, you want the best, the highest qualified person to come in, whatever that qualification word means. And what we find is that's actually not true. The idea of merit doesn't really come in as it only comes in as a stick to beat people with. The reason why you can't is merit, whatever that means. And so what I'm finding is it seems like a weird game that we're playing, right? Where we keep trying to dodge like the illusion that we might be being unfair, or we might not be doing equity or merit or equality in such the same way, but it's always going to be a moving target insofar as we would just like fewer, we don't like the idea of doing the remediation work. Like, that's not fun. It seems like for the institution, they don't want to have to do to correct issues of historical wrongs, and they'll do whatever they can to try to get out from under it.
So that linguistic piece you just explained to us seems to be a source of fortification of existing structural modes of discrimination and power imbalances. But I'm also wondering what the psychic costs of those differing linguistic valences, say between affirmative action and merit, are upon Black students. Have you been able to get a fair sense of that?
A bit. I can talk a little bit about just from my research, how that's oriented, but also from my own personal experience. I remember I attended undergraduate in 2014 through 16 as a transfer student. And I remember I had a colleague, a white colleague, who we were taking some classes together in linguistics. And I was saying, I'm applying for grad school. I'm nervous, I'm not applying to a lot of them. So if they say no, I don't know what I'll do. And they were like, "Oh, you'll be fine because you have affirmative action, right? So they kind of have to take you." And I was like, "No, first off, I'm graduating with honors. But secondly, we don't, in fact, have affirmative action, right? Like we haven't for, quite a while now. But the idea still existed, right? And this was a person I would have considered a friend, right? They weren't trying to hurt me or to disparage me in any way, but they just assumed that things would be easier for a Black person in context to accessing to these institutions than not, because of a policy, even after the policy had been repealed. And so what does that do to a person? What did that do to me? It really gave me an occasion to reflect on, like, how are people seeing me and what I'm doing, right? Do they think that I'm here because of a unfair edge or a leg up? And how do I feel about that if they do? I had to come to a place where I had to decide that it was immaterial what they thought, because what they think may or may not align with the reality, right? In 2014, we don't have access to affirmative action. That doesn't stop you from thinking that I got in on it, right? So I do myself harm by dwelling on it because I can't do anything about that, right? Within the research, I find that there's a surprising number of folks who might be more sympathetic to affirmative action and or DEI bans, right, that are Black. The idea is that, famously from like a Clarence Thomas perspective, he famously kind of maligned that he got his degree from Yale due to affirmative action, and he felt like it cheapened his degree because people will look at him and say, I don't know if you really earned it, like this discourse of really earning it. And it's seems to be very easy for folks to fall into this trap, right? The psychic trap of the idea of having really earned it versus the idea of literally doing anything to kind of help kind of level the playing field. I think this is especially effective for a lot of folks if they're kind of like just doing a lot of surface learning. You don't really look into it and spend time thinking and reading and talking to people about it. It's very easy to fall into the idea of saying, I don't want to be a diversity hire, right? I want to earn it on my own merit. These discourses come up very often. And I do think that I understand them. I think that they're rooted in a good place, a good, hardworking ethos. But I think that's a sign that the messaging has been very effective up to this point.
Okay, let's go back and look at a chapter from the history of UCLA's own history. When a program was developed that represented, in some sense, both an alternative to and, I suppose, an element in the longer narrative of affirmative action as it has unfolded over the course of half a century. And that's the High Potential Program, which was started in 1968.
Yes.
Tell us what interests you about the High Potential Program.
Absolutely. So the High Potential Program, as you mentioned, was started in 1968, and it was an affirmative action program, right? The idea of saying we need to go and find folks from historically underrepresented and or Black, but in this case, the first year was Black and brown students, and we need to bring them in, and we need to go to where they are, because the underlying ethos there was, we don't just want the fancy 1%er Black folks. We want the Black folks who have been impacted by the history, who have been more severely impacted by the history of segregation in this context. So they went to places like South LA and to East LA, and they set up recruitment shops to pull people. They pulled 100 in the, several hundred in the first year, and evaluated and admitted 100. They just admitted them into the University of California, Los Angeles under a special admit purpose, similar to like the idea if you were an athlete or had a special talent. This is the way they were admitted, but then they were engaged with the university. This was a 3-year program. And in that program, we see a lot of the programmatic formation of really cool programs that help to benefit students like myself, even like 40 years later, right? The existence at UCLA right now, a lot of it's been subsumed into what's called the Academic Achievement Program, AAP, at UCLA. They have a lot of the programs present in that department and in that division that were developed through the High Potential Program. Things like peer learning facilitators, things like the summer program, the summer bridge programs like TSP and things like this. Not just students like myself, but myself in particular benefited from those, and they were piloted through the High Potential Program in 1968, and it ran for 3 years. There's some really cool information in the archives at UCLA about this, so you can check in special collections if anyone was interested. But I think it's useful to look at the past in order to try to project about what's possible in the future, right? So in this case, we can look at it, how did they do recruitment and admissions for the bodies that they were interested in giving an opportunity to, and look to see where they went, right? So I'm not saying all the Black people in the world live in South Central LA, but what I'm saying is there is at least a bit of attention to the idea of the class status of a lot of these racially minoritized and historically exploited individuals, right? And attending to that in your praxis. In so doing, there was also programmatic development that was kind of wrap around or high touch, right? We did have a high touch pedagogical model in places like historically Black colleges and universities, which concedes to the point that this might be a very strange place for you, right? And you might need a little bit more hand-holding to try to make sense of it, to get the best out of your opportunity here. Let's factor that in on the front end, as opposed to just saying, I let you in, hands off the wheel, good luck, because we do find that does not result in a lot of success. So that program was I think a trailblazing program that I do find that was very successful in a lot of different ways, but of course fell victim to underfunding towards the end, and was absorbed into a larger program.
And when you think back to the High Potential Program and its successes in the relatively short period of time it existed, in fact, a very short period of time it existed, 3 years, what do you learn as a takeaway in thinking about where we're at now in this most fraught time, when there's not only a rolling back of the somewhat measured progress that represented by affirmative action, but there's a full throttle assault on the university, and certainly DEI as a feature of university life today. So what do you think we can take away from the relatively successful experiments that have been undertaken in plotting a path for the future?
Absolutely. I do think that looking at the High Potential Program and other programs like it really inform, one, a sense of how far we've come. Like, to elaborate on that point, none of the elements that are foundational to the recruitment and the admissions policies through the High Potential Program are legally permissible in the contemporary world, right? You cannot do race consciousness and you cannot do quote unquote quotas, right? And as a result, you cannot do High Potential Program recruitment for good or for bad, right? So we can learn that there was a strategy and it was deployed, and it's not beyond the realm of the imagination that we could just go to where people are and invite them into the university. That's not beyond our imagining, and we may yet return to it. The other thing is we can get a sense of reimagining the what and the why of our limitations, right? If I were to foundationally come and say, look, I would like to admit more Black people into, say, a major, because maybe we have a major that's generally unintegrated. Considering the legality of that is an interesting enterprise. Just explore, like, why can't I do that? What is kind of barring me from doing it? But I do think in the contemporary world, given the, for good or for bad, the Trump administration and the attack on higher education, the Department of Education, on DEI, like all of these different attacks. Much of this we always thought was impossible, that you couldn't do the things that he is doing, that it was illegal to do, and that there would be some check or some institution that would stand in the breach and make it so that that end was not possible. And what we're finding is that it's not as true as we would have liked it to have been. And in this case, it's not as true on the right, on this more conservative, small government, anti-DEI world. There's a lot of possibilities. There's a lot of things that could have been done. So I would love to encourage us to kind of reflect on that and say, well, what are those things that we can do, right? I'm not advocating per se that we just find a law and break it, but I'm advocating for the idea that we should try concertedly to reach the ends that we say that we desire, right? By way of a as an anecdote, right? So I remember I was playing football when I was young. It was the Mighty Mites. It's like middle school, just tiny. I was a small little wide receiver. It was awful. But it was fun. I had a great time. And so I remember we were playing a game. We were losing terribly, right? And the opposing team had a lot of flags being called on them, right? But we were down by a bunch, and the coach called a timeout, called us into a huddle, and asked us the question, do you know why we're losing? And I reactionarily just responded quickly, because they cheating, because I thought that was the easiest, cleanest example of why, right? It's a great response in that context. They were cheating, they were fouling, they were offsides, they were roughing the passer, they were doing all these things. That's why they're winning. And the coach responded very calmly. He said, no, we're losing because the other team is playing to win. And by playing to win, what he meant by that is that they are pushing every advantage because they came here to win. And if they're going to win on this side, if they're going to get a little advantage by kind of jumping the line a little early, if they're going to get a little advantage by, pushing the receiver a bit earlier and hoping that they don't get called on it, that's what they're going to do because they're playing with an intention that they should win the game. And so it's been my general assessment that I don't think that as public higher education in particular, I don't think that we've been playing to win, where win is access to Black liberation through access to higher education, right? We've not been playing to win. We, prior to this year in February, have never been sued for violations of Prop 209, which is the ban on affirmative action or race consciousness in hiring, admissions, and contracting. We've not tried hard to kind of effectuate our ends. And the little bit that we have done in a very half-measure, lukewarm, capitulating bit, they're trying to take that away from you too. So moderation as a message, moderation will not save us. Capitulation will not save us. We're just getting further and further away from the goal. And this might be a good time to reimagine and reorient around the actual goals and strategize around how do we play to win.
Well, on that note, and with the charge to play to win, which is its own very interesting sociolinguistic term, that we could unpack for another hour, but another time. I want to thank you, Dr. Jamaal Muwwakkil, for being with us on Then and Now and for such a stimulating conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. It's been great being here with you.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.